Hi everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves, and today I want to talk about the book Sanctuary. This was the book that we read last month for the Readers Inc. book club. It's hosted by Conrad from The Deckled Edge. I'll leave all the links down below to finding that. By now you've heard me probably talk about this book club a lot. I just think it has been an invaluable part of my reading life lately. I am not in classes anymore, and so reading as a community and as a group is something that I really love doing, and this has given me the opportunity to do that. So please join if you have any interest in reading some curated books and discussing them in a kind of elevated intellectual manner. Am I selling this thing? It's really great. This month we're reading The Picnic at Hanging Rock. I'm about a quarter of the way through it. I'm really enjoying it, and last month we read Sanctuary, so let's get started. Sanctuary is kind of famously William Faulkner's foray into pulp fiction. He talked about how he wanted to write this as like kind of a pop culture type exercise, and he was just trying to get the money or whatever. I kind of take that with a grain of salt, not only because he did multiple drafts of it, and so who knows what the difference was between where he started with the book and where he finished with the book, but also because I'm just not that interested in author biographies when I first approach a text. I frankly don't know that much about William Faulkner, and I'm okay with that, even though I study that period of American literature, and someday I will learn more, and I think that that can be valuable. For me personally, I like approaching the text kind of without that biographical information and figuring out what the text itself is saying. It's kind of the difference between like a new historicist approach to literature, which means that you like take all of this cultural context, historical information, and apply that to what is in the novel, versus a kind of formalist type approach where you pretend that all that cultural context doesn't exist. I don't really like to take it that far, but I do like to take intention and like writing procedures, like I said, with a grain of salt. Sanctuary is the story of a kidnapping, and like a lot of William Faulkner's work, it's really hard to describe it in terms of plot. Basically, this woman named Temple goes with her boyfriend on a date, and things go wrong, and they end up in this kind of dilapidated southern mansion, like out in the middle of nowhere. Turns out they're bootleggers, they're criminals, and they kind of get involved in this sort of criminal underground, and Temple gets kidnapped by them, though using the word kidnapped even is too simplified. Like a lot of Faulkner's work, this book deals a lot with time and place, and kind of messing with our sense of time and place as we read. So the first 3 chapters I remember reading on the book club page, people had kind of a hard time figuring out what was going on, and I was also one of those people. He takes 3 different settings and approaches them without clearly telling us kind of how time is passing, and I think that this is one of the tricks that he uses as a novelist. He's always very preoccupied with how time moves, and his characters are always either completely committed to a linear conception of time, where they're like, yes, my life up to this point has worked in this way, and so it proceeds that I'm going to end up in these circumstances with these conclusions, right? But there are often some characters who defy that sense of time, who don't see their lives in this progression of linear fate, and instead dare to break out of that progression. And I would say that this novel is very concerned with the former ideas of time. Even though the narrative itself plays with the way that time is kind of constructed, how it speeds up and slows down, it's still a linear novel, but it's kind of fractured or fragmented across viewpoints. The characters in the novel are still very trapped in a sense of time and place. So they often feel like their fates are completely inevitable and inescapable, and that leads to really tragic circumstances. And one of the characters that seems to be most fixed in fate and time is Temple. The book always talks about the way that she's imagining the way that her body is going to move through time, and then she always follows those pathways, and she doesn't use, a sense of imagination or creation to change that inevitable fate. So in our reader group, people were really upset with the way that she reacted to the kidnapping. And I'm not going to give anything away, but I could see where they were coming from. It's very frustrating to watch her in these circumstances, and I think that frustration comes from the way that she fixates on time and the way that she's trapped within the kind of conventions that a linearity would expect from her. So So for example, she seems trapped by her gender, she seems trapped by her culture, she seems literally trapped by the people that kidnap her, and most importantly, she and a lot of the characters in the book seem trapped by their setting, which is this kind of failed Southern aristocracy. And I think that sense of being trapped is really akin to what we feel when we watch horror or when we read horror. Some people were commenting that Tobe Hooper must have read this book because there were so many similarities, especially in the beginning, to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I completely agree with that. I mean, there's this old man in a wheelchair who never speaks, and Faulkner describes him as having phlegm for eyes. I mean, it's just absolutely disgusting. And you have this girl that's flailing around in front of him and unable to leave, and just like we kind of like laugh at her a little bit in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's also just like completely horrifying, right? And the sense of horror, partially from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is not necessarily from the gore, which is definitely horrific, but it's also from the sense of being trapped. Not only the victims, but also this like inbred, disgusting family being trapped in this house, being trapped in their economic circumstances, and not to get too far into Texas Chainsaw Massacre, being trapped in kind of horror tropes. And I think that that's partially why Sanctuary has this kind of pulp fiction feel to it. Not that it's a lesser novel, but because it is dealing with these kinds of horror tropes and just genre constrictions in general. And I think Faulkner shows the way that a writer can defy genre tropes, can elevate them or expose their weaknesses through a kind of creation in writing that doesn't necessarily adhere to the linearity of time that these doomed characters adhere to. Okay, once again, I have finished a review without being fully confident that I conveyed myself articulately at all, but let me know what you thought of Sanctuary if you were part of the book club or if you have read it previously, or what you think of Faulkner in general, maybe why you haven't read any Faulkner yet. I know some of his more canonical works are way more difficult to read, and I am personally very attached to Faulkner's short stories, and especially to the book A Light in August. That is my favorite Faulkner, and I think that it will always be my favorite Faulkner no matter how much I read. I'm certainly not a Faulkner expert or anything. But yeah, let's have a conversation about time and Faulkner and American Lit and book clubs and whatever you want to talk about. And I'll see you later.